They sent 500 soldiers to bring her in. 500. For 1 Omega. The Alpha King had laughed when his war general recommended it. He had laughed, and then he had looked at the report again and stopped laughing.
The latest dispatches confirm it. We must act.
Because the report said
Understood,
that the
sir.
Omega
What are your
called
orders?
Kael Mourne had
Mobilize
been
the troops
identified
here.
as
We
the
march at
sole
dawn.
survivor of the
It
Ashvale
will be
border
done, sir.
massacre. A battle in
The
which
latest dispatches confirm
230
it.
of the
We must
king's
act.
elite forward
Understood,
wolves
sir.
had been
What are
destroyed
your orders?
in a single
Mobilize the troops
engagement
here.
with
We march
no
at dawn.
enemy force large
It
enough
will be
to
done,
account
sir.
for the casualties. The report said the wolves who found the site had found her standing in the middle of it, alone, covered in blood that was not hers. Her gray Omega field tunic torn at one shoulder. Her hands at her sides. Her eyes open. Not afraid. Not injured. Just standing there in the wreckage of 230 soldiers like someone who had finished a task and was waiting for the next one. He sent 500. What the Alpha King did not know, what his war general did not know, what nobody who had ever crossed paths with Kael Mourne in her 23 years of being classified as an Omega with no wolf form on record and assigned to field support roles in the border garrison had ever known, was why she had never shifted in front of anyone. It was not because she could not. It was because the last time she had shifted, at age 15 during a training accident in the southern garrison, the training ground had been destroyed in a radius of 40 feet. 3 senior beta trainers had been thrown clear. The garrison commander had looked at her across the destruction with an expression that told her very clearly what happened to wolves that could not be explained within the existing classification framework. She had locked it back down that night. She had kept it locked for 8 years. She had survived 8 years of being the lowest-ranked support wolf in the border garrison, doing the work nobody else wanted, carrying the weight nobody else would pick up. Surviving on the margins of a military community that found her classification confusing and her performance record inconsistent and her continued presence vaguely irritating. And then 300 of the Alpha King's soldiers had attacked the village she was stationed to protect. And the people in that village had been
Soldiers
running
of the
and
night,
screaming,
the
and
stars
the children
align
had
for
been
our
running,
victory.
and the wolf she
Forward,
had been
march as
locking
one.
down for 8 years had looked at what was happening and made a decision that 8 years of Kael's careful management could not override. It had come out, and she had let it. And when it was over, 230 of the 300 soldiers were gone. The remaining 70 had run. And Kael Mourne was standing in the field, and the village was still standing, and the people were still alive, and she was looking at what she had done and making calculations about how much time she had before the report reached the Alpha King. The answer was, not enough. But she was going to use every second of it. Subscribe, comment, like, share. Hit subscribe right now before this story goes any further. Leave a comment telling us what you think Kael is going to do next. Share this with everyone who loves a wolf heroine who does not wait for permission to be what she is. Like the video. Chapter 1. What she left behind. The village of Thorngate sat at the southern edge of the Ashvale border range, close enough to the king's military territory that it received garrison protection, and far enough from the garrison command center that the garrison protection it received was whatever soldiers the command found least valuable to assign elsewhere. For the last 3 years, that had meant Kael Mourne and 4 other low-ranked support wolves whose combined assessment profiles made them the default assignment for every post that nobody wanted. Kael had not minded. She had learned a long time ago that the posts nobody wanted were often the posts that left you alone enough to function on your own terms, and functioning on her own terms was the primary project of her adult life. She did not need recognition. She did not need rank advancement. She needed enough distance from command oversight that the specific nature of what she was would not become visible to people who would respond to it badly. Thorngate had given her that distance for 3 years. She had spent those 3 years being genuinely useful to the village in the ways that low-ranked support wolves were useful, maintaining the perimeter wards, coordinating the supply chain for the garrison post, training the village's civilian self-defense volunteers with the specific practical knowledge of someone who had spent 8 years in border garrison postings and had accumulated a comprehensive understanding of what actually kept people alive in contested territory as opposed to what the garrison command assumed kept people alive. The village had responded to this by treating her the way small communities treat people who are useful and present and do not cause trouble. Not warmly, exactly, but with the specific texture of being seen as belonging, which was more than she had experienced in most of the garrison postings that preceded Thorngate. She was in the perimeter ward maintenance sector at the eastern edge of the village when the attack came, which meant she was the first wolf in Thorngate to pick up the scent and the advance formation movement through the southern approach corridor. 300 soldiers. Not rogues. Not border raiders. The king's military insignia on their forward scouts was visible in the thermal reading that her specific sensory capacity gave her at ranges that should not have been possible for an Omega-classified wolf. She ran back to the village. She got the civilians moving in the time she had, which was not much. She got the 4 other garrison wolves positioned at the secondary perimeter. She coordinated what she could coordinate in 7 minutes with what she had available, and she knew, with the precise assessment of someone who had been doing this for 8 years, that it was not enough. 300 king's soldiers against 5 support wolves and a civilian population. The mathematics were not survivable. She stood at the village's southern entrance as the forward formation came into the open ground, and she looked at what was coming, and she felt the wolf in her chest do what it had been doing for 8 years every time it calculated the gap between what the situation required and what she was allowing herself to provide. It pressed. She had always pushed back. She looked at the village behind her. At the people running with their children toward the northern evacuation route she had established in her first week at Thorngate, because she had always known this day had some probability of arriving. At the 4 garrison wolves taking positions that were brave and entirely insufficient. She looked at 300 soldiers who had come to destroy a village that had done nothing to anyone. She stopped pushing back. The shift was not the careful managed thing she had practiced in private in the forest outside Thorngate on nights when the compression became physically painful and she needed to release enough to continue functioning. This shift was the complete release of 8 years of managed suppression, and it happened in a single breath, not sequential, not building. Immediate and total, and accompanied by the specific atmospheric effect that she had first produced at age 15 and had spent 8 years making sure nobody would ever witness again. The ground cracked. Not a tremor. A concussive wave that moved outward from her position in every direction, and the forward formation of the king's soldiers hit it like a physical force, and the front 2 ranks went down before anyone in the formation had processed what was happening. The wolf that stood in Kael's place was not what the Omega classification system had a category for. She was the color of iron in deep water, a dark gray so deep it was almost black in most light, with eyes that had shifted from their standard dark brown to the specific burning silver that came with the full expression of whatever she was. She was large in the way that could not be attributed to diet or alpha blood or any of the standard variables, large in the way that changed the geometry of the space around her. The soldiers at the front of the formation who were still on their feet had stopped moving. Their wolves were telling them something their training had not prepared them for. Kael did not wait for them to finish processing it. What happened over the next 40 minutes was not something she thought about during. She was entirely present and entirely operational, and the specific military intelligence she had accumulated over 8 years of border garrison service was available to her in the wolf form with a clarity and processing speed that her human form's careful management had always limited. She moved through the formation with the geometry of someone who had been studying how formations worked and how they failed for 8 years, and who was now applying that study at a speed and scale that the formation's commanders had no tactical response for. When it was over, 230 soldiers were gone. 70 had broken formation and run at some point during the engagement. She had let them run. She had the precise military intelligence to know that running soldiers were the most efficient possible transmission mechanism for information. And the information she wanted transmitted to the Alpha King's command was the information that the 70 running soldiers now carried in their bodies. That Thorngate was not worth the cost. She shifted back. She stood in the field, and the village was behind her, and the night air was cold, and she made her calculations quickly because she had learned a long time ago that the period immediately after an engagement was when the most important decisions had to be made. The 70 soldiers would reach command within 2 days at standard travel pace. The report would reach the Alpha King within 3 days. She had 3 days before the next response arrived, and the next response would be larger and would be aimed specifically at her rather than at the village. She went back into Thorngate. The village elder, a woman named Bessa, who was in her late 60s and had been running Thorngate with the specific combination of practicality and stubbornness that small community leadership required for 23 years, was standing at the village entrance when Kael came through the southern gate. Bessa had sent the civilians north. She had stayed. She looked at Kael. She said, "I always knew you were something we did not have a name for." Kael said, "I need to leave Thorngate." Bessa said, "I know." She said, "Where will you go?" Kael said, "Somewhere that the king's next response hits me and not this village." Bessa said, "There is a place in the northern range. The old wolves call it the Deepwood Sanctuary. I do not know if it is what the old wolves say it is. I know it is the place my grandmother told me that people went when they needed to not be found." Kael looked at her. She said, "I have been at this post for 3 years. Tell me something I have not figured out about you yet." Bessa said, "My grandmother was not a villager. She came from somewhere else and she chose to stay here, and she never told me where she came from or why she left. But she told me about the Deepwood Sanctuary like someone who had been there and knew it to be real. She said, she also told me that the sanctuary recognized something in the blood. She said not everyone who went looking for it found it." Kael put on her traveling pack. She had packed it the day after the Thorngate posting began because she had always known that the day would come when she needed to leave fast. She said, "Keep the civilians in the northern evacuation shelter for at least 4 days." She said, "Do not tell anyone I went north." Bessa said she would tell anyone who asked that the garrison Omega had disappeared during the attack. She said she would tell it with the specific quality of someone who had watched an Omega be overwhelmed and assumed the worst. Kael said, "You are a very capable woman." Bessa said, "I know. Go. You have used up 10 minutes of your 3 days already." Kael went north into the dark of the Ashvale mountain range with her pack on her back and her wolf settled in her chest for the first time in 8 years, not compressed and managed, but simply present, warm and certain and entirely oriented toward the direction she was moving. North. Toward whatever the Deepwood Sanctuary was. Toward whatever came next. Chapter 2. The King Who Went Himself. Alpha King Dorian Vale had ruled the 6 northern territories for 11 years with a combination of genuine strategic intelligence and the kind of personal authority that did not need to perform itself because it had been tested enough times in enough genuinely difficult situations that it had long since stopped being performance and become simply what he was. He was in the war room when the report arrived. His war general, a battle-experienced alpha named Corvin who had been serving in that role for 7 years and who Dorian trusted with a completeness that was the product of 7 years of evidence rather than assumption, put the report on the map table and stood back and let Dorian read it. Dorian read it. He read it again. He said, 230. Corvin said, confirmed. The 70 survivors are in the medical wing. Their account is consistent, and their physical state is consistent with what they describe. Dorian said, 1 wolf. Corvin said, 1 wolf. Omega classification, field support posting, no wolf form on record in the garrison registry, 8 years of service across 6 border postings without a single incident report. Dorian said, until this incident. Corvin said, until this incident. Dorian looked at the report. He looked at the casualty list. He looked at the survivor accounts, which used language that military wolves did not typically use in formal reports because military wolves were trained to describe engagements in the operational vocabulary of formation and position and force ratio, but which in this report abandoned that vocabulary almost immediately in favor of language that communicated something the operational vocabulary did not have a category for. Words like enormous. Words like the ground. Words like eyes. One account
The
said
reports are clear.
it was
The
not
enemy
a
is
wolf.
advancing.
It was
We must
something that
mobilize
used
the
to be a
garrison
wolf a
immediately.
long time ago before
Understood, sir.
wolves were
I'll
what
prepare
they are
the
now.
troops. I'll coordinate
Dorian
the
set
supply
the report
lines.
down.
Good. Move
He
out.
said, I am going north personally. Corvin said, your council will object. Dorian said, my council objects to most things I do, and the objections have not yet produced an outcome that persuaded me they were right. He said, I want a small company. 10 wolves. No formation insignia. We move as a scout unit, not as a military response. Corvin said, you are going looking for her. Dorian said, I am going to understand what happened at Thorngate before I decide what to do about it. Sending 500 soldiers was the wrong response to the first incident. Sending 500 more soldiers in the same direction with the same framing would be a different kind of wrong. Corvin said, she destroyed 230 of our wolves. Dorian said, they attacked a civilian village. I want to understand that part of the report too. Corvin was quiet for a moment with the quality of someone who had a great deal to say and was deciding how much of it to say. He said, you have never gone personally to retrieve an asset before. Dorian said, she is not an asset. She is a wolf whose classification I do not understand, and whose actions I do not have a complete account of, and whose location is currently unknown, and those three things together constitute a situation that I should understand before it constitutes a threat. He said, or before someone else finds her first. Corvin said, someone else. Dorian said, the survivor accounts describe a capability that has not been documented in the current classification framework. That means it predates the current framework. The only bloodlines that predate the current classification framework are the ones in the old records, and the wolves who maintain the old records are not all working in my interest. He said, I want to find her before the archivists do. Corvin held that information. He said, I will prepare the company. They went north the following morning, 11 wolves in the unmarked deep gray travel clothing of a scout unit, moving at the pace that Dorian set, which was the pace of someone with urgency and sufficient fitness to sustain it without advertising the urgency. His wolf had been doing something since the report arrived that Dorian had not had a complete account of either. It had been oriented north with the specific persistent quality of orientation that he associated with the bond signal and that he had not experienced in 32 years of living, because the bond was something that happened to some wolves and not others. And he had arrived at a private acceptance that it was not going to happen to him and had organized his life accordingly. The orientation was not ambiguous. He did not say this to Corvin. He did not say it to anyone in the company. He tracked it internally with the careful attention of someone who had spent 11 years making consequential decisions based on incomplete information and had developed a very disciplined practice of distinguishing between what he knew and what he was inferring and what he was hoping and what he was going to act on regardless. He knew the orientation was there. He was inferring its source. He was not going to act on the inference until he had more information. On the second day of travel, they entered the Ashvale mountain range, and the forest changed in the specific way that forests change in high-altitude, old-growth terrain. Denser and darker, and carrying in its air a quality that was different from the lower forests in a way that had more to do with what had been living in it for a long time than with the altitude itself. His wolf pressed north. On the third day, following what Dorian had classified as directional information from the wolf and Corvin had classified as the king moving through the forest like someone who knew where they were going without a map, they came over a ridge and saw the Deepwood Sanctuary. It was not what Dorian had expected. He had not had specific expectations, but he had general ones, the general shape of what ancient protected spaces looked like in the stories that circulated around old bloodlines. What he found was something more immediate than stories. A valley in the high Ashvale range that the surrounding mountain terrain had been organizing itself to protect for what appeared to be a very long time. Stone formations at the natural entry points that were both geological and not entirely geological. Trees at the valley entrance that were old enough that their root systems would have required centuries, and that were arranged in a pattern that was not random. And in the valley, at the base of a large oak that dominated the valley floor, a wolf. She was in human form, and she was awake, and she had been watching them come over the ridge, and she had not moved, because she had calculated that moving was not the right response, and because her wolf had told her something about the 11 wolves on the ridge that her experience-based assessment of threat was still in the process of processing. Dorian came down the ridge alone. He had done this before. The decision to approach alone was not impulsive. It was the product of reading the situation and the wolf at the base of the oak and concluding that arriving with a company of 11 behind him would communicate the wrong thing, and he did not currently have the luxury of communicating the wrong thing. He got to 20 feet from her and stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. She was wearing the torn and field-stained gray Omega support tunic of the border garrison, dark travel trousers and worn boots. Her hair was dark and worn pulled back. Her skin was medium warm brown with the outdoor tanning of someone who had spent 8 years in field postings. Her eyes were dark brown with something in them that he was reading carefully. She was not afraid. She was assessing him with the specific quality of someone who was very good at assessment and was currently doing it at speed. He said, "I am not here with a formation." She said, "I can count. 11 wolves. No insignia. A scout unit configuration with you at the front means you are either the Alpha King or his most trusted general, and the reports describe the king as someone who goes himself when the situation is significant enough." She said, "So you are the king?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And you came personally?" He said, "I wanted to understand what happened at Thorngate before I made another decision about it. I find that understanding is generally more useful than additional force." She said, "That is an interesting position for someone whose soldiers attacked a civilian village." He said, "I gave no order to attack Thorngate." She was quiet for a moment. He said, "I want to understand that part of the situation as well." The engagement order that sent 300 soldiers to the Ashvale border sector was not issued from my command. She said, "Then it was issued by someone inside your command structure who had access to deployment authorization." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you came north personally instead of sending 500 soldiers because you were trying to understand whether the wolf who destroyed 230 of your army is a threat to you specifically or whether there is another frame for what happened." He said, "That is an accurate summary." She said, "The people of Thorngate were running. I was the only thing standing between them and 300 soldiers. I made the assessment that I could change the outcome, and I acted on it." She said, "I have been making the assessment that I could change outcomes for 8 years, and choosing not to act on it, because the cost of acting on it was always going to be this conversation. I decided the cost was acceptable in this specific situation." He said, "What changed?" She said, "Children were running." The Deepwood Valley was quiet around them with the specific quality of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time and had just received the information it was waiting for. Dorian's wolf was not quiet. It was pressing toward the wolf in front of him with a specificity and certainty that he had spent 32 years not experiencing and was now experiencing with a completeness that made the 11 years of running a kingdom feel like something he had done in preparation for standing in this valley at this moment. He said her name. "Kael." She said, "You know my name." He said, "I read your file. All 8 years of it. Before I came north." She said, "There is not much in my file." He said, "No. There is not. What is in it is interesting for what it does not say rather than for what it does." She said, "What do you want from me?" He said, "I want to understand what you are. Not as a classification. Not as a military asset or a threat to be managed. I want to understand it because whatever you are has been present in my kingdom's border garrison for 8 years without anyone knowing it was there, and that has implications I need to think through carefully. And thinking through them carefully requires that I have more information than the survivor accounts from Thorngate give me." He said, "I am also aware that something is happening between my wolf and yours that I did not anticipate when I came north, and that I am not going to pretend is not happening." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That is a great deal of honesty from an Alpha King." He said, "I find that honesty is generally more efficient than alternatives in situations where the other party is capable of reading through the alternatives." She looked at him with those dark brown eyes that had the silver threaded through them at the edges when the light caught them right and said, "You should tell the 10 wolves on the ridge to make camp. This is going to be a long conversation." Chapter 3. What this sanctuary remembered. The Deepwood Sanctuary Valley had a structure at its center that was not immediately visible from the entrance because the old trees had grown around it over centuries in a way that incorporated it into their canopy rather than revealing it. Kael had found it on her second day in the valley. It was a hall, not large, built of the same pale stone as the natural formations at the valley entrance, but worked by hands rather than geology, old enough that the working showed in the smoothness of the stone and the specific quality of the joinery rather than in any remaining sharpness. Inside, the walls carried carvings that she had been reading for 2 days with her mother's old bloodline dictionary that she kept in the bottom of her traveling pack because she had always known it would be relevant eventually. The carvings were a record, not a history in the modern sense. A record in the old sense, the specific documentation of something that needed to be preserved because the people doing the preserving understood that the knowledge would be needed again and did not know when. She brought Dorian to the hall on the morning after their first long conversation. They had talked through the night, not continuously. There were stretches where one of them was thinking and the other was letting them think, and that quality of the silence between them, the way neither of them filled it with anything other than what needed to be said, was something Kael noticed and filed as significant. She had spent 8 years in garrison postings where silence between people meant either hostility or indifference. This silence was neither. Inside the hall, Dorian looked at the carvings and then looked at her and said, "You can read these," she said, slowly. "My source document is incomplete, but I have been working through them for 2 days." He said, "What did they say?" She said, "The short version is that the classification framework your kingdom has been using to sort wolves for the last 400 years was established after a war that eliminated every wolf who did not fit the framework. The war was conducted specifically to establish the framework's authority, not because the wolves it eliminated were threats to anyone, but because they were threats to the people who wanted the framework to be the only system." She said, "The Deepwood Sanctuary was built by the wolves who survived that war in sufficient numbers to leave a record. They came here because the sanctuary's specific geographic and energetic properties made it invisible to the framework's enforcement arm. The carvings document who they were and what they carried and why it mattered that at least a record survived even if the bloodlines themselves did not." She said, "Some of the bloodlines did survive. Embedded in the general population. Classified incorrectly because the framework did not have the categories for them and because the wolves carrying them had learned, from the war and from watching what happened to wolves who showed what they were, to present as something less." She paused. She said, "I have been classified as an Omega for 23 years. My actual classification does not exist in the current framework. The carvings have a name for it in the old tongue. It translates to something like Stormblood. The old framework described it as the capacity of a wolf to channel the collective force of the pack through a single body under conditions of extreme necessity." She said, "It is not common. The carvings suggest it requires both specific bloodline components and a specific kind of development, meaning it tends to emerge most completely in wolves who have spent a long period under extreme compression because the compression and the release together produce something that neither does individually." She said, 8 years of managed suppression in border garrison postings counts as extreme compression." Dorian was quiet for a moment. He said, "The Thorngate engagement," she said, "was the release." "Yes," he said, "and the unauthorized deployment order that sent 300 soldiers to Thorngate." She said, "Someone knew or suspected what I was and wanted to either trigger the expression in a context they could observe and control, or eliminate me in a high-casualty engagement that would not require explaining why they were targeting a low-ranked Omega. The two possible intentions have different implications for who is behind it." Dorian said, "The archivists." Kael said, "I have been reading about the archivists in the carvings for 2 days. They are the continuation of the enforcement arm that conducted the war 400 years ago. They maintain the current classification framework not because it is accurate, but because it keeps the bloodlines they identified as threats to their authority suppressed and classified as something harmless. She said, "They have been in your kingdom structure for 400 years. They are embedded in the institutions, including, I would infer from the unauthorized deployment order, your military command structure." Dorian said, "My war general has been trying to identify the source of that order since the report reached me." She said, "The archivists do not leave clean trails. They have been doing this for 400 years. He said, "What do you want?" She said, "That is the second time you have asked me that." He said, "The first time I asked it I did not have the context I have now. I am asking it again with the current context." She said, "I want to know what I am. Completely. Not the parts the carvings give me, but the full picture that requires a living source. I understand that you have the authority to address the second and third ones, and that addressing them would cost you something politically, and that the cost is not trivial." He said, "And the first one. What you are completely." She said, "There is someone in the valley that is not either of us." She had felt it since the previous afternoon. A presence at the valley's deep interior, the specific quality of something very old and very aware that had been registering their presence in the sanctuary and was deciding whether to make itself known. Dorian said, "I felt it this morning." She said, "It is in the old hall. It has been there since before I arrived. I think the sanctuary is not just a record. I think it is an active repository of something that is still here." They went deeper into the hall. The far end of the hall had a door that Kael had not been able to open in 2 days of trying, not because it was locked by a physical mechanism, but because it was locked by something that responded to a biological key rather than a mechanical one. When she had pressed her hand to it, it had registered something and had not opened. When she pressed her hand to it now with Dorian standing beside her, it opened. Both of them. Together. The room beyond the door was small and the source of the presence was immediately clear. Not a person. Not a wolf in any current sense. Something that the carvings outside called a kept one, a consciousness preserved in the sanctuary by the same people who had built it, maintained by the sanctuary's specific properties through 400 years, waiting for the biological key that would allow it to be accessed. The key had been 2 wolves whose bloodlines complemented each other in the specific way that the kept one had been calibrated to recognize. A Stormblood Omega. And a king whose line carried something else. Something old. Something that the archivists had not been able to suppress in the royal bloodline because suppressing it would have required eliminating the bloodline entirely, and the political cost of that had been assessed as too high 400 years ago. The kept one communicated not in words, but in the specific transfer of information that very old wolf consciousness could achieve through sustained proximity. And Kael sat on the stone floor of the inner room and received it for 3 hours while Dorian sat beside her and received what came to him, and the sanctuary held them both with the patience of something that had been waiting for exactly this for 4 centuries. When it was done, she said, "I know what I am now." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you know what you are." He said, "I have always known what I am. I did not know what it connected to until now." She said, "The archivists are going to come north." He said, "They already know we are here. The sanctuary was invisible to their instruments before we opened the inner door. It is not invisible anymore." She said, "How long?" He said, "Corvin sent a position report to the capital last night as standard protocol. The archivists have someone in the communications system. They have the position." She said, "How many do they have?" He said, "I do not know. But they have had 400 years to build a force capable of handling the specific threat they were organized to prevent." She said, "Then we need to be ready before they arrive." He said, "We have 10 wolves at the Ridge camp and whatever the sanctuary provides." She said, "The sanctuary provides more than it appears to. The carvings were not just a record. They were instructions." He said, "For what?" She said, "For what happens when the Stormblood is fully expressed and the king's complementary bloodline is present and the threat that the sanctuary was built to withstand finally comes to the door." She said, "I have been at compression for 8 years. I know how to use what I am now. I know what direction to point it." She looked at him. She said, "Stay close. This story is not finished with you yet. Stay right here." Subscribe and leave a comment and tell us what you think of Kael. Has a wolf heroine ever hit you this hard before? Share this story with every person you know who deserves a romance where the Omega does not wait to be saved. Like the video. Comment your favorite moment from this chapter. Share this everywhere you can. Every subscribe, every like, every comment, every share keeps this story alive and makes the next chapter come faster. Do all 4 right now and do not stop watching. Subscribe. Like. Comment. Share. Chapter 4. The War at the Valley Gate. The archivists came on the 4th day. Not the cautious approach of scouts or the formal assembly of a military unit. They came with the specific organized efficiency of people who had been planning for this contingency for 400 years and had a protocol for it that did not require improvisation. 200 wolves. Not King's military. The archivists maintained their own force, the same enforcement arm that had conducted the war 400 years ago, updated and maintained through 4 centuries of institutional continuity. They wore deep charcoal without insignia, and they moved with the coordinated precision of an organization that trained for one specific mission and had been training for it without interruption for a very long time. Dorian had spent the 4 days reorganizing what he had. 10 wolves from his scout company, himself included. 11 total. Against 200 trained archivist enforcement wolves. The mathematics were familiar to Kael. She had looked at bad mathematics before. The sanctuary had provided what the carvings promised it would provide. Not weapons. Not additional fighters. Something that the carvings called the ground of the proven, which was the specific state of a space that had been prepared by the presence of complementary bloodlines expressing fully. A state that affected every wolf who entered it in proportion to their relationship to the old classifications. Wolves carrying suppressed old bloodlines were strengthened by it. Wolves whose authority derived from the suppression of those bloodlines were weakened by it. Which meant that in the Deepwood Sanctuary Valley, the 10 wolves Dorian had brought were not operating at their standard capacity. They were operating at something significantly beyond it. Kael had spent the 4 days training with them, not showing them something theoretical. Training the way she had trained border garrison volunteers in Thorngate, with the specific practical knowledge of what actually worked and what the casualty reports said happened to formations that relied on standard responses to non-standard threats. The 10 wolves were not the force they had been when they arrived at the valley. She was at the valley entrance when the archivist formation came through the mountain approach corridor. Dorian was at her left. Corvin was at her right. The 10 wolves were positioned at depth in the valley in the specific configuration she had designed over the last 4 days, not a standard defensive formation, but something she had built from the principle of making the terrain work rather than against it. The archivist commander came to the front of the formation. She had seen his type before. The specific quality of someone who believed that what they were doing was right because they had been doing it for so long that the doing had become indistinguishable from the righteousness. He was middle-aged and gray-haired, and he carried himself with the authority of someone whose authority had never been seriously challenged. He said, "The Stormblood must come with us. The king's involvement in this situation ends here." Dorian said, "The Stormblood, as you call her, is a wolf in my territories whose classification has been deliberately falsified for 8 years by an organization operating inside my kingdom without my knowledge or authorization. She comes with no one she has not chosen to come with." The commander said, "The Alpha King does not have jurisdiction over what the archivists manage." Dorian said, "The archivist's authority derives from the classification framework that was established 400 years ago. The classification framework was established after a war of suppression that your organization conducted against wolves who had done nothing wrong. The documentation of that war is in this valley, and I have read it. The framework's authority is not legitimate, and the organization that enforces it is not operating inside any legal structure I recognize." He said, "You have until I finish speaking to reconsider your position." The commander looked at him. He said, "Take them." The archivist formation moved. Kael shifted. She had shifted 4 times in the 4 days of preparation, building back up to the full expression from the starting point of the Thorngate engagement. And each shift had been more complete than the last, as the compression release cycle that the sanctuary's inner chamber had explained to her gave her an increasingly clear understanding of the mechanics of what she was. Stormblood did not simply produce a powerful wolf. It produced a wolf that could channel the sanctuary's ground of the proven as a directed force, which was not what a standard wolf could do and was not what any amount of physical capability alone could produce. The Iron Dark Wolf that stood in the Deepwood Valley was the full expression of what 8 years of managed compression and 4 days of the sanctuary's influence and the complete transfer of knowledge from the Kept One had produced. The Archivist formation hit the valley entrance, and the ground of the proven hit the Archivist formation. It was not a physical impact. It was the specific effect of 200 wolves whose authority and capability derived from the suppression of the old bloodlines entering a space where those bloodlines were fully expressed and the complementary energetics of the space had been charged by 4 days of preparation. Their formations did not break from physical force. They broke from the inside, from the wolf nature in each of them receiving a signal that their training and their institutional conditioning could not override. The signal that said the thing they had been organized to suppress was standing in front of them in its full expression, and their wolf nature could not pretend otherwise. Some held. The ones who were most deeply conditioned, who had been doing this the longest, and had the most institutional identity invested in it. Kael handled those directly. Dorian and his 10 wolves, operating in the ground of the proven at the elevated capacity it provided, handled the formation's flanks with the specific tactical precision of what 4 days of Kael's training had produced in wolves who were already experienced fighters and were now fighting in an environment that made them more than they had been. The Archivist commander shifted and came directly for Kael. She had expected that. He was large and experienced and had been doing this for a long time, and his wolf was the product of an organization that had specifically bred for this application for 400 years. He was not weak. He was not unprepared. He was the most capable individual fighter the Archivist enforcement arm had produced in a generation. And he was in her valley. On her ground. The fight was not long. It was not easy. He hit her twice, and the second hit was significant, and the pain registered completely, and she used it the way she had learned to use the compression, as fuel rather than impediment. And she hit him back once with the sovereign hold that the Kept One had described and that the Stormblood expression made possible in a way that standard wolf strength could not replicate. He went down. Not dead. She had not killed him. She needed him alive because an alive Archivist commander was evidence and a dead one was simply a body with no institutional implications. She shifted back. She stood in the valley entrance and the formation behind the commander had broken, the majority withdrawing in the specific organized way of a trained force conducting a tactical retreat rather than a rout. And the valley was filled with the aftermath of an engagement that had lasted 22 minutes and had produced a completely different outcome than the mathematics suggested it should have. Dorian came to her. She had a cut on her left arm from the commander's second hit that was bleeding through her sleeve. He looked at it. She looked at it. She said, "It is not deep." He said, "I know. I can see." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I have been more all right and less all right. This is somewhere in the middle." He looked at the valley behind them, at his 10 wolves already moving through the aftermath with the professional efficiency of experienced fighters assessing the engagement. At the Archivist commander sitting on the ground with 2 of Dorian's wolves standing over him. He said, "What comes next?" She said, "The Archivists have more than 200 wolves. This was their rapid response unit. The full organization is larger." She said, "But the rapid response unit coming here and failing is going to produce a specific kind of information in the rest of the organization. Organizations that have been operating without serious challenge for 400 years tend to respond to the first serious challenge poorly. The internal dynamics of how they process failure are going to create opportunities that a better organized adversary would not create." He said, "You have been thinking about how to dismantle this organization." She said, "I have been thinking about it for 4 days. It is the kind of problem I find interesting. He said, 8 years in border garrison postings thinking about problems. She said, the postings that nobody wants are quiet enough for thinking. He said, I have a kingdom with a significant institutional problem embedded in it. I have a war general who has been trying to find the source of an unauthorized deployment order. I have a council that is going to require a coherent account of what has happened in the last 2 weeks before they will authorize any of the remedial actions I have in mind. He said, and I have the carvings in this hall which constitute historical evidence for a war of suppression that my kingdom has been a party to for 400 years, and which I am going to need to address in a way that is both constitutionally sound and politically survivable. He said, I am thinking about what an institutional problem solver with 8 years of field experience and a complete understanding of the suppressed bloodline history might contribute to that project. She said, that is a careful way of asking something. He said, I am trying to be careful because the last thing I want to do is frame something as an offer that is actually an instruction. She said, I appreciate the distinction. She looked at the valley, at the sanctuary that had waited for 400 years and had given them everything it was built to give, at the carvings that would need to be documented and authenticated and brought into the formal record of the 6 territories in a way that could not be dismissed or suppressed. She said, I have some conditions. He said, I expected you would. She said, the classification framework gets restructured before anything else. Not reformed. Restructured. Starting from the actual biology rather than from the categories that were established to serve an institutional agenda. He said, agreed. She said, the archivist prisoners, including the commander, are processed through formal legal channels with the sanctuary documentation as evidence. No quiet deals. No institutional management. Public record. He said, agreed. She said, Thorngate gets a permanent garrison posting of actual quality. Not support wolves who are assigned there because nobody wants them. A real garrison with appropriate resources. He said, agreed. She said, Bessa gets formally recognized as the village elder she has been for 23 years. The village designation record shows she has been classified as temporary administrator. That gets corrected. He said, agreed. She looked at him. She said, you are agreeing very quickly. He said, your conditions are reasonable. The speed of my agreement is a function of the quality of the conditions, not of inattention to what I am agreeing to. She said, there is one more condition. He waited. She said, whatever is happening between our wolves does not become a political arrangement. I am not a treaty. I am not an alliance. Whatever this is, it is between us on terms we establish for ourselves or it does not exist. He looked at her with those dark amber-flecked eyes that she had been reading carefully for 4 days, and that had not once communicated anything she had subsequently found to be false. He said, I have been running a kingdom for 11 years on the principle that the most important arrangements are the ones you make, because they are right rather than because they are expedient. I have no interest in treating this differently from that principle. He said, whatever this is between us is between us. She said, good. She said, then let us go deal with the commander. They walked across the valley together, and the ground of the Proven was warm in the air around them, and the sanctuary held its quiet with the specific quality of something that has completed the purpose it was built for and is now simply at rest. Chapter 5. What they built after. The institutional reckoning took 8 months. Not because the evidence was insufficient. The sanctuary carvings, authenticated by 3 independent scholars whose methods and integrity Dorian trusted, and who confirmed the authenticity both technically and historically, constituted a formal record of the War of Suppression that was more comprehensive than anyone who had been working on historical revisionism for 400 years had expected to surface. The kept ones preserved testimony, transferred to documentation by Kael over 6 sessions in the inner chamber, added a witness account from the period itself. The 8 months were required because institutional dismantling at the scale of the archivists, embedded in the 6 territories for 4 centuries, required the specific combination of legal process and political management and public documentation that could not be rushed without producing the kind of instability that would ultimately cost more than it resolved. Kael understood this. She had thought about institutional problems for 8 years in border garrison postings that nobody wanted. She worked through it with Dorian's War General Corvin, who had identified the source of the unauthorized Thorngate deployment order as a senior logistics commander who had been an archivist plant for 12 years and whose network inside the military command structure required 3 months of careful mapping before it could be systematically addressed without alerting the nodes that had not yet been identified. She worked through it with the council scholars who were responsible for the classification framework revision, insisting at every session that the new framework be built from documented biology rather than from political convenience, and winning that argument incrementally across 11 council sessions over 4 months. She worked through it from the capital, because after the first month she had moved from the Deepwood Sanctuary to the capital on the basis that the work required proximity to the institutions it was addressing and remote engagement was a significant handicap that she was not willing to except for the duration. Dorian had offered her formal housing in the palace complex. She had declined on the grounds that formal housing in the palace complex communicated a political position that she had not yet decided she wanted to communicate, and that the communication should be her choice at the timing of her choosing. She had taken an apartment in the Scholars' District, which was close enough to the palace to be accessible and far enough to be her own ground. He had accepted this without pushing it. That acceptance was itself information that she continued to accumulate alongside the rest of the information she was accumulating about him over 8 months of working in close proximity on a project that mattered to both of them for reasons that were not identical but were complementary. He was what he had presented himself as in the Deepwood Valley. Someone who made decisions based on understanding rather than on institutional convenience. Someone whose authority was genuine rather than performed. Someone who held to the positions he took rather than revising them based on the political temperature of the room he was currently in. She had spent 8 years in border garrison postings assessing people accurately as a survival mechanism. Her assessment of him held across 8 months of close observation. The new classification framework was formally ratified in the 5th month. It was not a perfect document. Kael had spent enough time around institutional processes to understand that perfect documents were theoretical objects and functional ones were the product of compromise, and she had chosen her compromises carefully. The Stormblood classification was in the framework, defined in the language the sanctuary carvings used, which was the most accurate language available. There were 4 other classifications that had not existed in the old framework that the scholar committee's work on suppressed bloodlines had identified as requiring formal recognition. 12 wolves came forward in the first month after ratification with self-identifications that matched the new categories. 47 came forward in the second month. The number was still climbing. The Archivist Commander's trial, conducted under the formal treaty legal process with the sanctuary documentation as primary evidence, resulted in a formal finding of institutional wrongdoing that extended to the organization he commanded. The organization was formally dissolved. Its assets were transferred to the Documentation Commission that Dorian established to complete the historical record of the War of Suppression. Kael testified at the trial for 2 days. She testified with the specific quality she brought to everything, complete and precise, and entirely without performance. And the formal record of her testimony was itself used by the Classification Revision Committee as a source document for the Stormblood definition. On the last day of the 7th month, the village of Thorngate received its permanent garrison assignment. Kael had written the garrison specification herself. The new garrison commander was an experienced alpha who had been interested in the border posting and had been told by his superiors that the border posting was not appropriate for his capabilities. His superiors had been archivist plants. Bessa's formal recognition as village elder was processed in the same administrative bundle. Kael sent Bessa a letter on the day the recognition was confirmed. Not a formal communication. A personal one, the kind she had not been in the habit of writing because personal communications required a receiver who cared about the content, and she had spent 8 years in postings where that was not the case. Bessa sent back a letter that was 3 times longer and contained enough practical information about the new garrison commander's incoming integration with the village's existing defensive infrastructure that Kael spent an hour on it before she recognized it for what it was alongside the practical information. It was the correspondence of someone who was going to keep writing. In the 8th month, Dorian came to her apartment in the Scholars District. Not for a working session. They had completed the day's working sessions at the council building, and he had walked with her to the Scholars District in the specific way he had developed over 8 months of walking with her. Close enough to be present and comfortable enough with the distance between them that he did not manufacture proximity she had not offered. He had been doing this for 8 months. Matching the pace she set. Not pushing and not retreating. Simply being present in the ways she allowed and consistent in those ways and patient about the rest. She had been reading this for 8 months with the same precise attention she brought to everything. At her apartment door she said, "Do you want to come in?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then come in." He came in. The apartment was the apartment of someone who had moved in with a pack and 2 boxes of books and had spent 8 months acquiring things as they became necessary and no faster. It was functional and personal in the specific way that spaces become personal when the person inhabiting them is finally, for the first time, living somewhere they chose. He looked at it. He said, "You have a great many books." She said, "I have been acquiring them for 8 months. I spent 8 years in postings where I could not keep them." He said, "The Bloodline Dictionary." She said, "On the shelf by the window. And 3 more I found in the Capitol Archive that the archivist's suppression had misfiled as folklore texts." He said, "You found additional source texts." She said, "I have been doing that for 8 months in parallel with everything else. The Documentation Commission does not know about those 3 yet. I wanted to understand them first." He said, "And do you understand them?" She said, "Mostly. There are sections I want your input on. Some of what they describe connects to your bloodline rather than mine, and your perspective on what you received from the kept one would help me interpret the sections I am uncertain about." He said, "You are asking me to come back." She said, "I am asking you to come back and look at 3 texts with me." He said, "Yes. Obviously." They sat at the table by the window with the 3 texts between them, and the Capitol outside the window going from afternoon to evening, and the wolf bond that had been present since the Deepwood Valley and growing through 8 months of careful proximity was warm and certain in the air between them, and neither of them performed not noticing it. At some point she said, "I have been running calculations." He said, "I know. I have been watching you run them." She said, "The calculation I keep arriving at is that the most important thing I have spent the last 8 months assessing is not the institutional problem." He said, "What is it?" She said, "Whether you are what you presented yourself as in the valley. In 4 days of significant pressure with significant stakes." She said, 8 months is a more comprehensive data set." He said, "And the calculation?" She said, "Holds." He looked at her across the texts and the city light coming through the window and the wolf bond warm between them, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I have been running a calculation of my own." She said, "What is it?" He said, "The calculation is whether the woman who stood alone in a field in Thorngate and made the decision to stop managing what she was because children were running is the same woman who has spent 8 months in my capital doing the most complicated institutional work my kingdom has faced in 400 years with the same precision and the same complete absence of self-interest." He said, "The calculation holds too." She said, "Good." She said, "I want to show you the section on the complementary bond expression. It connects to what you experienced in the inner chamber, and I have 3 different interpretations of the key passage, and I want your assessment." He said, "Show me." She turned the text toward him. He moved his chair closer to read it. Outside, the Capitol went about its evening with the specific quality of a city that does not know what has been built inside one of its scholar district apartments over 8 months of careful, honest, incremental construction. The new classification framework was in full implementation across all 6 territories. The Documentation Commission was 3 months from completing its historical record. Thorngate had its garrison. Vessa was writing letters. And the wolf they had sent 500 soldiers to retrieve was at a table with the Alpha King, reading texts by window light, her wolf entirely at rest for the first time in 8 years of being the thing nobody had a category for. She had a category now. She had built it herself. That is the story of Kael Mourne. The Omega who spent 8 years managing something that could have ended everything, who let it go the one time it mattered most, who then walked into the Alpha King's capital and dismantled 400 years of institutional suppression with the same precision she had used to survive inside it. If this story hit you, then do these 4 things right now. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Leave a comment and tell us your favorite moment in this story. Was it Thorngate, the valley, the fight, or the apartment? Share this story with everyone who deserves a wolf heroine who has never been what they were told she was. Like the video so more people find Kael. Subscribe, like, comment, and share.